found in John chapter 11, verses 1 to 16.
So John chapter 11. Now a man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. And it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. And when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judah again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in a day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awake him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he might take rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, but we may die with him. God bless his reading. Amen.
Thank you, man. Probably one of Jesus' most famous miracles is what we're going to be looking at over this morning and tonight, the raising of his friend Lazarus. What is the themes that come out from this chapter? Well, there's 3 L's really. 2 of them we're going to look at this morning, and the third one we're going to look at tonight. And the 3 L's are simply this: love, light, and life. All things that we find in Christ. Love, light, and life. We know exactly who is ill. We know that it's Lazarus. We know where he lives. He's from Bethany. We know his family situation. He's got 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. We also know from all the gospel accounts that this was a family very close to the heart of Christ. We are all close, I know that. But during his earthly ministry, there were havens where he could go, where he knew he would be received without question. And in Bethany, he had such a house here. A family that supported him, a family that had an insight into who he was, a deep faith in God, and a recognition of Christ and his ministry. You can imagine then in verse 3, when the sisters send a message to him. Because remember, Jesus has taken himself a few days' journey away from Jerusalem because they sought to stone him when he was last there. So he's taken himself back to the Jordan, where it all started, as we looked at last week. So he is some distance away. And Lazarus is severely ill. And the sisters send a message in verse 3, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. In our English translations, we don't pick up what type of love is being talked about. Our word for love is so inadequate because it doesn't give differentials. But the word that is used here is the word filial. It's the filial love. It's the love that comes from affection and from friendship. They were confident in their friendship with Christ. They were confident in his affection. And they could refer to Lazarus as one who Christ loved in that term of affection and friendship. One who loved Christ and Christ loved him. And I have no doubts that in their heart they thought that when Jesus received that message, he would rush to Lazarus' aid. Because why are they waiting? It's not just to pass on information, is it? It's a plea for help. In verse 4 it tells us that Jesus shared the message and he responds verbally to the message that's given. Now it could be that the messengers were given this verbal response and they took this back. It could be that it was said just for the hearing of his disciples. It's a bit unclear. My own personal view is that it was a verbal message given, but I'm not saying that that is 100% certain, we can't say that. But it does say that when Jesus heard that message, he said, he responded to that message, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Jesus understood from the start to the finish exactly what would unfold and why things were developing the way that they were. And it's so easy to just read it because we know the outcome. But imagine when that message, if that message does get back to Mary and Martha, this sickness is not unto death, it's for the glory of God. There would have been relief. It's going to be okay. But things don't always work out the way that we think, do they? And the Bible is very careful to point out to us in verse 5 the motives behind Jesus' actions. That it's not a lack of concern. It is not that he doesn't have affection and friendship towards Lazarus. And we know that from what we read in verse 5. Because the Bible makes it very clear to us, wants us to know now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Notice that. Jesus, look at the order it's in. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Jesus loved them all. But the word love there is not filial, it's agape. It is that love that goes deeper than a love that just comes through affection and friendship. It is a love that is based on a determinate act of the will. I will love you. You see, so often our friendships, they grow hot and cold, don't they? At various times in our life, people cross our paths and we can have a deep, strong friendship with a person over a period of time. And yet later in our life, that friendship is not maybe as deep as it once was. It was given for a moment in time. But the love that God has for us doesn't vary. It doesn't waver. It doesn't grow hot and cold. He is determined that he will love us. It's an act of his will. Not based on what we do, not based on what we say. It's his determination to love us. And that deep, deep love, God has it for this family. They thought they could rely upon his friendship and his affection. And Jesus' response is, I love you so much more than you will ever know. And it's important that we understand that he loves them. Because some of the things that occurred over the next few days almost seem cruel to us. But they come from a heart of love, and we must always remind ourselves. And that's why I had that song we just sang. How deep the Father's love for us. What kind of love is this? You see, they remind us that God always loves us. Because without knowing that he loved them, verse 6 would seem totally at odds. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. He stayed there for 2 more days. The disciples no doubt had heard what he had said, and no doubt they would start to interpret what they thought that inactivity that lack of urgency, they would have interpreted what they thought that meant. And they would have thought that it meant that all would be well, that there was no need to go, that they could stay there. And they were quite pleased about that, because Bethany is only 2 miles from Jerusalem. Bethany is just around the corner from all those people who picked up stones who wanted to kill Jesus. And the disciples were very pleased not to be in that locality. Can you imagine their surprise when after the 2 days, Jesus says to them, okay, let's go up to Judah. Let's go up to Judea again. Well, that's the trip that they were relieved they wouldn't be making 2 days earlier. And now Jesus is saying, no, we are making this journey. That's the very place I need to be. And that's exactly where I'm going. And the disciples point out to him in verse 8, Rabbi, teacher, lately the Jews have sought to stone you. Chapter 10, verse 31. Recently the Jews have sought to stone you. And you're going there again? You can almost see the incredibility of what they're hearing. We're going back there? I thought we'd come away from there because you were afraid of the outcome of what would happen if you stayed. And yet now you're going back. So confusing to them. So confusing for us, isn't it? About the timing of God. You see that something that God says no to, two days later he's saying yes to. Something that God says no, not now, and yet later can say yes now. And something we struggle with is the fact that we think we know what God's will is in a situation, and then God says, yeah, but it's different now, because the timing is different. Because timing is everything with him. Jesus turns to them in verse 9 and he says, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble. He sees the light of this world. But if you walk in the night, you're going to stumble, because the light is not in you. We've looked at love, and now we come across this thought of light. Jesus understood that his earthly ministry had a start and an end. Jesus understood that he was here for a mission. He understood he was here for a purpose. Jesus understood that limitation of the day that he had been given. We are given set times on earth. And during that time we are able to serve him in ways that we can never serve him when we're in heaven. There are things we can do during this day on earth that we will never ever be able to repeat. There won't be the need for a gospel message in heaven. There won't be a need to visit the sick in heaven. There won't be a hungry mouth to feed in heaven. You see, all those things are limited for our time here on earth. There's no bereaved family to support in heaven. There's no separation in heaven. There is a day, and we are given our day. And it is important that we listen to what God is asking of us in the day in which we live. And it is important that we have his light on our life, in our hearts. That we use the days that he has given us for his glory. Again, one of the songs we sang earlier. It's not about me. This isn't for me. It's for you. And we live in a world that tells us we live for ourselves. And God says, no, you live for me. You're not here to please yourself. You're here to do my will. Jesus knew the timings of God. Jesus knew his life would not come to an end until the appointed time of God. And Jesus confidently walked amongst his enemies before that time. Various occasions we read his time had not yet come. They couldn't touch him until Jesus consented to it. Love and light. We also looked just a few weeks ago at the fact that Jesus said that we would come to him for living water. And in knowing him, water would come out of our lives. That combination of light and water is so essential for life itself, isn't it? In order to give life, the light of God needs to be in our hearts. And we need to have access to the living water that comes from him. Jesus turns to his disciples and he tells them why he's going back to Judea. Verse 11 he says, our friend. I love the fact he includes the disciples now in this. It's not just my friend, he's our friend. Our friend Lazarus, he sleeps, and I'm going that I may wake him up. They were very confused by his use of this word sleep. But it's very consistent in the Word of God that Jesus refers to the death of the saints as sleep. And when Jesus is talking about Lazarus, for him to go and raise Lazarus, for him it's no more difficult than us going to give somebody a stir and wake them from sleep. You see, for us, the pain of death is that people are out of reach. But with Christ, people are never out of reach. He is the Lord of all. Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. And then, of course, the disciples pick up on the fact that he said he's sleeping. And as we all know, sleep is good if you're not well. And they're thinking, well, if he's sleeping, then that's good, his body's recovering. So they don't understand what he's talking about. So Jesus has to plainly tell them, look, Lazarus is dead. Again, imagine their confusion. Well, why have we waited here for 2 days then? Well, Lazarus is dead. And then I remind you that Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus. Because he says in verse 15, I'm glad for your sakes. Again, it seems almost cruel that they should have to go through that. That he says, I am glad for your sakes that I wasn't there, that you may believe. It is quite surprising how much Jesus wants to grow our faith. It is quite surprising that the main aim during this chapter is that people's faith will be deepened. His disciples were following him because they did believe. It wasn't that they were unbelievers. It was only Judas who betrayed him, remember. The others stayed true to him. So Jesus is not talking about that initial faith. He is talking about the deepening of their faith. That they might believe that he is the God who he is claimed to be. That they might have an insight and understanding about how powerful God really is. That God would be glorified in everything. And we have a hint. We have a hint that Jesus is going to make a difference when he arrives. Because in verse 15, he doesn't say, let us go to them. It's not a case of going to just give sympathy to the bereaved sisters. He turns around and says, let us go to him. He has business still with Lazarus. Thomas, unfortunately the one who was often referred to as doubting Thomas, because we are very good at focusing on people's weak spots, and we are very good at remembering people's lowlights. Well, Thomas has highlights too, and he has strengths, because Thomas, called the twin, turns to his fellow disciples, and he says, well, let's go with him then, that we may die with him. Thomas understood the dangers of going back to Judah, but he turns to the other disciples and he says, well, if he chooses to go back, and even if it means death, better to die with him than to leave him. We sang that he is greater than life, and Thomas makes that decision himself. I would rather die with him than to live without him.
Yeah.
Maybe not as weak a brother as we sometimes paint him to be. Love and light. Never ever question the love of God. Never ever question the love of Christ. There are many things in life we might not understand, but this I know. He loves us with that deep, deep love. That agape love, that deep love, there's a determination of his will. The love that cannot be moved or budged. He loves us completely and always. And if we walk in his love, it's amazing what the light of God can shed on your path. And yes, we have difficult days, but far better to face those difficult days with the light of God with us than to be stumbling in the dark, because his light is not found in our hearts. We thank God that we know the story ends with a glorious victory, life. Jesus only raised 3 people during his whole 3 years on earth. He raised Jairus' daughter just after she had died, literally there on the bed. He came across a funeral procession and he raised the young man out of his coffin. And here he raises somebody who's been dead for 4 days. You see, it's not just 3 resurrections. It's different times of the process of life being taken. He is complete master over life and over death. He is the Lord, and he is on the throne. And we thank him for his great love and the light he gives us in our lives.